super tornado.
Deep in the frozen wilderness of Siberia, a research team recently arrived at a remote mountain burial site that had never been fully explored. Drone footage shows their vehicles crawling across the snow before they climbed a narrow icy path toward a strange rock formation. When they entered the chamber, archaeologists uncovered something astonishing: a large stone box hidden beneath the earth. As they carefully opened it, the lid revealed a sarcophagus covered in strange blue metal like ornaments and patterns. And what shocked researchers most was how unexpectedly modern the design looked, almost as if it had been built with knowledge far beyond its time. But the discoveries didn't stop. Their teams working in the frozen ground began uncovering enormous fossilized bones, including the skull of a gigantic predator with massive curved fangs preserved in ice. Nearby, another skeleton was unearthed that appeared far longer and more serpentine, resembling an ancient aquatic creature that may have once lived in prehistoric rivers or seas. With helicopters, drones, and entire camps set up in the valley, scientists spent days documenting the site before finally leaving with crates of artifacts and fossil evidence. An ancient aquatic creature that may have once lived in prehistoric rivers or seas. With helicopters, drones, and entire camps set up in the valley, scientists spent days documenting the site before finally leaving with crates of artifacts and fossil evidence. Humanity has carried a deep, unspoken fear for thousands of years regarding the end of the world. And ancient texts have long spoken of signs in the heavens and on the earth like fire and pillars of smoke, which is exactly what is giving so many people the chills right now. These indicators no longer feel like distant prophecies, because they seem to be unfolding across the plains of Texas at this very moment, where the first catastrophe hit as a massive wall of fire that wiped out entire neighborhoods and forced hundreds of thousands to flee their homes in a single night. Even more terrifying were the unexplained glowing lights that moved through the crimson sky in ways no one can define, leaving people paralyzed with fear across the region. These extreme events are no longer happening in isolation, and if you think this is where it ends, you might be mistaken, because the third event is shaping up to be more than just a phenomenon, and instead might be the most powerful warning we have ever received. If there was ever a time to turn toward faith and prayer, this is likely it. So if you trust in a higher protection, please take a moment to like this video and leave a prayer for your family in the comments. The disaster known as the Crestline Fire began as a sudden spark in the remote mountain ranges of eastern Oregon. But the true terror wasn't the origin point so much as the unnatural speed at which the flames began to move. It became nearly impossible to establish any kind of containment line, because the fire was racing forward so aggressively, forcing over 200 residents to abandon everything as the front line pushed dangerously close to major housing developments. This event quickly escalated to become the largest wildfire in the region since the start of the year, fueled by vicious dry mountain winds that acted like gasoline as the destruction moved closer toward the outskirts of Portland. The fire wasn't just burning anymore, but was actively racing across the landscape, swallowing entire forests and jumping across ridges to trap whole neighborhoods in its path. Thousands of people were left with no choice but to run, as entire towns found themselves surrounded by an environmental force that felt more like a living enemy than a natural disaster. There was no longer a visible sky over the state as it transformed into a suffocating sea of dark smoke, where thick black pillars blocked out the sun for hundreds of miles, turning the middle of the day into a ghostly, artificial twilight. Ash began to fall from the sky like heavy rain, while the air became thick and impossible to breathe. And locals reported that they could actually hear the fire coming, describing it as a monstrous living roar that combined with the constant scream of sirens and the thundering of helicopters to create a sound like a devouring storm. Many people caught in the chaos said it felt as though the very end was finally at our doorstep. And something else started to emerge during those surreal moments, when the midday sky turned pitch black and ash fell from the heavens like a gray winter rain. Because people weren't just looking at the clouds anymore, but were feeling a deep historical anxiety rising in their thoughts as fire moved faster than anyone ever imagined possible. These weren't just random events, because ancient phrases and long-forgotten warnings began to resurface in the public consciousness, speaking of a specific time when the Earth itself would start to alter its behavior. And signs would no longer come one by one, but would arrive collectively as a unified force of nature. This is exactly what was forewarned in the ancient scriptures of Joel 2:30, where it speaks of pillars of smoke, fire, and blood. And as the forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains began to burn and smoke filled the entire horizon, it felt like the very light of the world was fading away into a terrifying new reality. An unspoken but unavoidable question began to surface among the survivors who were fleeing in terror, asking if this was merely a natural calamity, or if it was the manifestation of a long-standing warning that humanity has ignored for centuries. However, what transpired next gave the chilling impression that the fire was just the opening act, because something far colder and more predatory was already spreading throughout the rest of the continent, while the mountains were still on fire. A ferocious Arctic winter storm broke out with startling ferocity and a level of force that defied modern meteorological models, as it covered over half of the United States from the Gulf Coast all the way to the Canadian border in a matter of mere hours. Thousands of miles were suddenly placed under emergency tornado warnings, as violent twisters began to make landfall across the plains of Kansas and Oklahoma, tearing through established towns and ripping the history out of the ground. In the dead of night, massive century-old trees were snapped like toothpicks and crashed into residential buildings, while roofs were torn completely from dwellings and heavy semi-trucks were flipped like toys by the unrelenting force of the atmospheric pressure. What started out as a seasonal storm swiftly mutated into something far more tumultuous, as a severe blizzard hit the northern corridors, covering major interstate highways with snow so deep that it made travel an impossibility. Drivers were blinded by whiteout conditions, unable to see even a few feet beyond their windshields, and in a matter of seconds, control was lost, as vehicles began skidding off the roadways one after another in a chain reaction of metal and glass. For many, it was already too late by the time authorities issued the urgent orders to clear the roads, because hundreds of accidents were already being reported across the region, and the national air travel system began to buckle under the sheer weight of the crisis. Over 4,000 flights were canceled globally, while Atlanta's international hub saw more than 500 delays alone, trapping thousands of travelers in a frozen standstill, while the southern regions were simultaneously engulfed in wildfires and massive dust storms that swallowed hundreds of square miles of land. At the exact same time, the East Coast prepared for a battery of strong storms, with winds reaching speeds of over 100 km/h, which were followed by an abrupt and unusual deep freeze that cracked infrastructure and left cities in the dark. Science calls this atmospheric instability, but these same disruptions carry a much deeper significance in the Bible as indicators that the end of the world is not a distant concept, but something that may be unfolding right now, as Psalm 147 describes the snow spreading like wool and the frost being scattered like ashes. The question of who can withstand such an icy blast remains unnerving, because the cold arrives silently, and with an intensity that feels like a targeted authority rather than a random weather pattern. You need to keep a close eye on the horizon, because what is being captured on camera right now is among the scariest and most bizarre series of events in human history, as strange, unidentified objects have started to materialize in the skies over the heartland. These things are sometimes completely silent and still before they abruptly change direction in ways that ignore the laws of inertia. And the mystery surrounding these unidentified aerial vehicles is coming back stronger and much more eerie than ever before. This phenomenon isn't new since the first reports of disc-like objects flying in formation near Mount Shasta back in 1947. But now these experiences are coming in waves that refuse to go away. A man walking his dog in rural Pennsylvania recently reported seeing two brilliant spheres hovering directly over his head, changing their geometric shape in midair before vanishing into nothingness. While another witness in Phoenix described a light in the sky bigger than any star that remained perfectly still for over half an hour. Neighbors emerged from their homes one by one, attracted by an inexplicable force, and stood in total silence, pointing upward and shaking their hands as they repeatedly asked the same question while filming the incident with their phones. Nobody had an answer, and there was only a growing feeling that something strange and something that wasn't supposed to be there had entered the familiar sky and claimed it as its own. While some claim these are just advanced drones or satellites, others point to the impossible flight maneuvers and silent hovering patterns that modern technology simply cannot comprehend, which aligns with the prophecy that there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, while nations fall into distress. The sky no longer feels like home, and the lights are still inexplicable, as the ground itself began to react by releasing a power far more ferocious than any storm, as if a trigger had been pulled deep within the Earth's crust. The country was devastated by a powerful chain of tornadoes in the spring of 2026, and the events in the Valley of New Hope felt entirely unprecedented because they didn't start gently but hit with a calculated level of precision. In a matter of hours, multiple strong tornadoes ranging from EF2 to EF4 struck simultaneously, slicing through wide agricultural fields before moving into the suburbs and leveling everything in their path. The devastation in New Hope was instantaneous, as fully loaded freight train cars were lifted from their tracks and hurled hundreds of meters through the air, as if weight were no longer a factor in the physics of the storm. Massive steel power towers were twisted like wire, and whole streets were reduced to piles of rubble in minutes, while the sky turned an unusual shade of sickly green and black just before the sirens were drowned out by a sound like a locomotive rushing down from the clouds. The winds became so powerful that it was physically impossible for anyone to stand, and automobiles were raised into the air and whirled around before being thrown into buildings with enough force to cause total structural collapse. Thousands of families lost everything they owned in a single afternoon, as the air became saturated with twisted metal and broken wood that rose hundreds of meters into the sky before falling back like a maelstrom of lethal debris. Rescue crews who raced into the disaster zones were overwhelmed by the scale of the damage, because the land itself looked like it had been ripped apart from above, with deep wounds and long ditches excavated out of the fields by an unseen force. Locals began comparing these tornadoes to enormous pythons that turn everything they touch into agonizing ruins and piles of ash. And many shared the same terrifying sentiment that this was more than just a storm, and instead felt like the ground was being torn apart by a conscious entity. This reminds us of the passage in Nahum 1:3, which states that the Lord has his way in the whirlwind, and the storm and the clouds are the dust of his feet, serving as a reminder of a power that moves with direction and force rather than at random. Even after the winds subsided, the devastation didn't stop, because something else had already started to move beneath the surface of the world, as unusual seismic activity began to trigger in locations that have no history of such destruction. South Carolina, which is normally stable, began experiencing hundreds of earthquakes of all sizes that started small but quickly shifted into something that made the floorboards move beneath people's feet and caused windows to rattle in their frames. Then came the deep, low sound like a subterranean thunder, rising from the depths rather than the heavens, causing walls to crack and tall buildings to tremble, as power lines were crushed or slanted at strange angles. People rushed outside in search of open space, attempting to flee structures that no longer felt secure as panic spread through the cities and families reached out to each other in a desperate attempt to find safety. The sense of solidity vanished in seconds as the earth became like a liquid surface. And while the impact was visible in the cities, it was even heavier and lonelier in the rural areas where the silence made the shaking feel more personal. Scientists identify this as tectonic tension and pressure accumulating along hidden fault lines. But the technical explanation did not allay the terror for those who felt like they were receiving a final cautionary tale as described in Luke 21:11 regarding great earthquakes and fearful signs. As the ground continued to quake in unexpected places, a new sign was ready to emerge. And this time it appeared as liquid fire rising from the depths of the earth, as the volcanoes of the Aleutian Islands began to roar with overwhelming intensity. Molten lava rose nearly 400 meters into the sky like imposing pillars of fire that turned the horizon into a glowing furnace, and forced the closure of major transport routes as burning pebbles rained down from above. It became impossible to breathe as volcanic ash coated every surface, and the air became thick with a pungent sulfur odor that seemed to alter the very chemistry of the atmosphere itself. Locals heard deep explosions originating from the core of the earth, as if the planet were awakening and moving in a way that had never been seen in recorded history. This was not a gradual organic release, but a violent surge of magma pushing through fissures under immense pressure, fulfilling the prophecy of blood, fire, and pillars of smoke. One concept started to emerge as the earth continued to spew ash into the sky, and that is the unnerving question of what happens when the ground underneath us finally stops being silent and starts to roar with a voice that cannot be ignored. Even more disturbing things started to emerge across the heart of the country, as the natural world began to fracture in ways that felt deeply intentional, and the animals themselves reacted with a frantic, primitive dread, as the surrounding mayhem grew to an unbearable level that no one could have prepared for in their wildest dreams. Just thinking about the events that unfolded next is enough to send a cold, paralyzing shiver down your spine as we explore the potential significance of these global indicators that suggest something massive and perhaps irreversible is shifting within the very fabric of our reality. In several parts of the high valleys of Montana, a strange and rhythmic motion began to ascend into the sky that was neither smoke nor clouds, but a shifting, translucent veil of darkness developing along the horizon that caused the midday sun to dim into a ghostly, sickly twilight within a matter of minutes. A deep vibrating hum began to fill the air, a sound more mechanical and guttural than any thunder we have ever recorded, and it felt like the incessant, grinding roar of a million heavy engines with no apparent physical cause, pressing down on the eardrums and the chests of everyone standing below in the fields. When people finally raised their heads in terror, they didn't see a typical storm system or a localized weather front, but instead witnessed a living, breathing, and terrifyingly coordinated hurricane of millions upon millions of migratory locusts, moving as a single hive-minded mass that swirled and twisted across the sky from one edge of the horizon to the other. Beneath this living shadow, the vibrant green of the ancient forests vanished in a heartbeat, and the rooftops of suburban neighborhoods in Missoula turned a crawling, pulsing black as the swarm descended with an unnerving, surgical accuracy to peel away every leaf, every blade of grass, and every piece of organic matter in a matter of milliseconds. Residents standing in their yards watched in a trembling, horrified silence as their entire livelihoods and landscapes disappeared before their eyes, muttering to themselves that it felt as if something intelligent were encircling them. a layered wave of biological destruction that no digital camera could truly capture in its full, suffocating scale. While modern science might try to label this as a simple population boom or a rare seasonal cycle triggered by shifting temperatures, those standing beneath the literal weight of that sound felt the weight of a much older and more terrifying truth, echoing the ancient warnings found in the book of Revelation 9:3, which describes a power given to the creatures of the earth to sting and consume the peace of the world. This was a physical caution about a force that leaves absolutely nothing behind. And when the hum eventually subsided hours later, it left a silence so heavy and so thick that it felt like it was filling the physical emptiness of the total ruin left in the swarm's wake. But the land was only the beginning of this unfolding sequence, because while the signs in the air became increasingly bizarre and impossible to explain, something even more profound and ancient was starting to emerge from beneath the crashing waves of the Atlantic coast of Maine. Reports began to surface of the legendary and rarely seen giant oarfish, known to ancient mariners as the silver heralds of coming doom, washing up on the rocky shores with their long, ribbon-like bodies reflecting the pale sun like polished, cold chrome. These creatures belong to a silent, pressurized realm hundreds of meters below the surface where sunlight never reaches and where human eyes are never meant to travel. Yet here they were, appearing in clusters and floating toward the coastline with big, lifeless, and unblinking eyes that seemed to belong to another planet entirely. Witnesses stood on the wet sand in total shock and disbelief, noting that these metallic bodies looked as though they had departed a deep, dark sanctuary they were never supposed to leave unless the very foundations of the seabed were being disturbed by something massive. Scientists point to shifting magnetic poles, thermal fluctuations on the deep seafloor, or underwater landslides. But the timing for many observers was far too precise to be a mere coincidence, as these rare appearances have historically been linked to massive shifts in the tectonic plates that follow rather than precede the sighting. The pattern is now becoming undeniable to anyone who is paying attention as it develops from the earth to the sky and from the crushing depths of the ocean to the heart of our most populated cities, making it impossible to ignore that the entire globe is reacting on every single level simultaneously. This brings to mind the ancient warning from the prophecy of Amos, which describes the mountains melting and the sea rising as a witness to the changing of the ages. The sea is no longer quiet, and something is emerging from its secret, hidden realm to suggest that the very foundations of our world are shifting in a way we cannot yet hear or see, but can certainly feel in our bones. Across the nation, we see creatures filling the air in biblical proportions, fire rising from the dry land in the deserts of Arizona, and the ground trembling where it had been motionless for centuries, creating a sense of convergence rather than a series of isolated accidents. It feels like a long-written hidden script is gradually coming to light, making us conscious that the world is changing not just around us, but beneath our feet, above our heads, and within the very core of the planet itself. Disasters are no longer the central issue. The issue is the sequence and the frequency. A deliberate and accelerating series of events designed to awaken those who are open to seeing the truth rather than simply inciting a blind, unproductive fear. The biggest risk today is not the storm itself, but losing our collective awareness of it in a modern world where everything is quickly labeled, explained away by talking heads, and disregarded as just another passing headline in a 24-hour news cycle. But at what point does the sheer frequency of these overlaps force us to admit that the concept of normal has ceased to exist entirely? As the earth groans and people feel a profound, unwavering uneasiness about the very surface of reality. These moments are a window, a final chance to readjust our perspective and see the direction in which we are moving before the pressure building beneath the surface becomes a total and uncontrollable explosion. In this situation, faith and heightened awareness are not escapes from a difficult reality, but are instead the only means of truly comprehending it, serving as an invitation to look far beyond the obvious and get ready for a much larger, more complex picture that is coming together like the final pieces of a cosmic puzzle. America is currently experiencing a breakthrough of total chaos that is happening all at once as a devastating and unprecedented tornado corridor ripped through the Snake River Plain, leaving thousands of families with only seconds to flee before their entire villages were reduced to splinters and dust. Meanwhile, a precision weather event in central Texas stopped directly over major metropolitan hubs, dropping ice stones the size of heavy grapefruits that instantly destroyed thousands of homes, shattered armored glass, and pulverized major transit roads into a landscape of craters. In the far west, the ground began to expand, buckle, and shift without a single drop of rain or a detected tremor, causing interstate highways to slide into deep canyons and floors to rise inside residential homes. While in the far north of the Yukon, ancient icebergs that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years suddenly flipped in perfectly calm water to reveal dark, prehistoric structures that had been concealed for ages. It no longer feels like regular, seasonal weather for the families caught in the center of this powerful and erratic storm system stretching from the high plains to the deep south, where the very wind has turned against the land without a shred of compassion or mercy. Tornadoes are now developing with terrifying speed in the middle of intense, purple lightning displays, emerging from the dark shadows as if they were being called upon by an unseen force to twist ferociously through the night where no one is prepared for their arrival. Locals describe a horrifying and repetitive pattern where the thunder roars with a frequency that shakes the very bones inside your body, and rotating clouds fall from the sky so quickly that there is no time for the emergency sirens to even begin their warning. People are racing down dark hallways and grabbing their children in the pitch black as buildings creak, groan, and bend under a force that feels entirely intentional and directed rather than chaotic or random. And sudden power outages are leaving entire states in a total, terrifying darkness that feels alive. There is no reliable communication. The roads are obstructed by fallen debris, and even the most familiar locations like your own living room no longer feel secure as parents hold their kids and pray while watching lightning strike the exact same spot dozens of times in a row. Meteorologists are quietly calling this outbreak completely unprecedented because the atmosphere itself seems to be breaking its own established laws of physics, leading people to ask the deeper, more spiritual question of why this is happening with such intensity all at once. These moments of total confrontation remind us of the words in the book of Ezekiel 38:22, where the heavens rain down an overflowing scourge of hailstones and fire as a sign of ultimate sovereignty, a moment when human certainty finally crumbles and a higher heavenly authority becomes undeniably apparent to all. In the late afternoon across the busy streets of San Antonio, the sky abruptly altered into a dark, bruised, and swirling purple just as traffic reached its absolute peak. And what started as a typical seasonal downpour rapidly became a metallic, lethal bombardment from above. The hail fell in powerful, relentless, and rhythmic bursts that didn't sound like natural rain, but like a constant, heavy hammer hitting the earth with a grudge, shattering reinforced glass and denting heavy metal, until drivers were forced to abandon their vehicles in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. Dash cams captured the constant collisions and the chilling sight of structural rooftops snapping under the sheer weight of the falling ice as the storm stalled directly over the city, refusing to move an inch, and instead intensifying its concentrated assault on the ground and the people trapped below. This is no longer about predicting a specific date on a calendar. It is about identifying a clear and present direction. And as the various global systems overlap and the intensity of the events increases, It is getting harder and harder for even the most skeptical among us to ignore that we are witnessing a total transformation of the world as we have always known it. The air itself feels different, charged with a tension that cannot be explained by barometric pressure alone, as if the very molecules are vibrating in anticipation of the next phase of this unfolding sequence. We see the wildfires in the Pacific Northwest behaving with a predatory intelligence, jumping over massive rivers and fire breaks that should have held them back, while at the same exact time, the Great Lakes region is seeing water levels fluctuate with a violent unpredictability that defies seasonal norms. It is as if the elements of fire, water, air, and earth are no longer in balance, but are instead competing to see which can provide the most powerful warning to a humanity that has been asleep for far too long at the wheel. The animals in the Florida Everglades are moving inland in massive numbers, fleeing something in the water that our sensors haven't even picked up yet, while the birds in the Midwest have stopped singing altogether, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence that hangs over the fields like a shroud. This convergence is not a mistake, and it is not a series of coincidences that can be brushed aside by a clever explanation. It is a call to look upward and inward to find a stability that the physical world can no longer provide. As we track these developments from the shaking ground in the Carolinas to the erupting peaks in the Cascades, the message remains the same. The time for distraction is over, and the time for a deeper, more profound awareness has arrived. We are all witnessing this together, a global audience to a cosmic event that spans from the deepest trenches of the sea to the highest reaches of the heavens. And the only question that remains is whether we will have the courage to acknowledge what our eyes are clearly telling us. If you feel this urgency in your soul, if you see the patterns as clearly as we do, then take this moment to reflect on what truly matters and hold your loved ones closer than ever before. Leave your thoughts and your prayers in the comments below, not just as a gesture, but as a testament to the fact that we are awake and we are watching the signs as they unfold in real time across this great land. May we all find the strength to face what is coming next with a clear mind and a heart full of faith. For the path ahead is illuminated by the very fires that seek to consume our old ways of thinking and replace them with a new, undeniable truth. The violet glow above the Washington Monument was not a mere trick of the light or a common atmospheric anomaly, but rather a haunting, silent shroud that seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, intelligent life of its own, signaling a moment where human governance and divine architecture collided in the stillness of the dusk. This wasn't the flickering of a standard aurora or the harsh glare of city spotlights reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. It was an localized, ethereal luminescence that felt as though the very fabric of the atmosphere was being pulled thin by an invisible hand. As the sky transitioned into a deep, bruised purple, the typical roar of the nation's capital fell into a vacuum of absolute silence, as if the air itself had been drained of the ability to carry sound, forcing politicians, tourists, and residents alike to stop in their tracks and gaze upward with a growing sense of spiritual dread. Have you ever felt a silence so heavy that it felt like a physical weight on your chest, making you realize that the world you thought you controlled was actually governed by forces far beyond your comprehension? This is the question that echoed through the streets of the District of Columbia as the violet light began to ripple like water across the marble facades of the great institutions of power, reminding everyone watching that even the most fortified structures of man are nothing more than dust when the heavens decide to speak. This silent convergence follows a terrifying sequence of events that has left the country reeling, starting with the unprecedented hail bombardment in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where engines were instantly choked by ice-clogged vents and heavy machinery simply ceased to function. Residents in the high-altitude towns of Colorado described the event not as a chaotic storm, but as something fundamentally different, something overpowering and purposeful that felt targeted with a mathematical precision. When grapefruit-sized stones fall from the sky with such accuracy that they seem to hunt for the most vulnerable targets during peak traffic hours, can we really call it a coincidence? Or are we witnessing the fulfillment of the warnings in the Book of Lamentations 3:12, where it is said that he has bent his bow and set us as a target for his arrow? Scripture never characterizes such destruction as pointless. Rather, it is presented as a harsh, unavoidable correction designed to undermine the false sense of security we have built around our modern systems. Why is it that these signs always seem to strike when we are most confident in our independence and most unprepared for our own frailty? As the sky continued to rain down judgment in the mountains, an even more disturbing phenomenon began to manifest beneath the foundation of the Florida Keys, far removed from the cold peaks but connected by the same invisible tension. Within hours, the ground in the coastal regions began to shift and move without the presence of a storm or the detection of a single earthquake, as if a massive subterranean pressure were being released from the very bowels of the earth. The most unnerving aspect for the locals was the suffocating silence of the movement. No alarms triggered, no rumble shook the windows, but instead, the earth seemed to be breathing in rhythmic pulses, expanding and releasing as the sand along the pristine beaches swelled and settled like a slow, terrifying tide. Geologists were baffled, drawing immediate parallels to the rare and unexplained breathing floor incidents of the past. Yet they could offer no comfort to the families who watched their floors rise and their walls buckle under a force that felt alive. Isaiah 24:19 warns us that the earth is utterly broken down and clean dissolved, reminding us that the ground beneath our feet is never just soil. It is a witness to our spiritual state, and when we retreat away from the Creator, the very land we rely on begins to expose its own instability. Does it frighten you to think that the very foundation of your home could turn into a shifting, breathing entity that refuses to remain still? This feeling of a world unmoored continued to spread into the frigid, isolated waters of the Gulf of Alaska, where massive icebergs that had remained immobile for centuries suddenly began to slowly rotate on their own axes in perfectly calm seas. There were no crashing waves or violent winds to force this movement. Instead, these ancient blocks of frozen history rolled over as if reacting to an invisible imbalance beneath the surface, revealing undersides that had been hidden since before the rise of modern civilization. As they turned, they released soft bursts of trapped, prehistoric gases and briefly exposed strange, unidentifiable creatures that vanished back into the dark depths before they could be documented. While scientists might argue that uneven melting causes a shift in weight and gravity, the timing of these inversions, occurring simultaneously with the disruptions in the sky and the land, suggests a deeper, more spiritual drift. Psalm 73:18 tells us that they are placed on slippery ground and cast down into ruin, a chilling parallel to how faith doesn't vanish in an instant but thins and warms gradually until the entire structure loses its equilibrium and flips for the whole world to see. What else in your life have you trusted as an immovable foundation that might actually be tipping beneath the surface right now? The volatility intensified as sudden wind vortices began to materialize under perfectly clear, average skies in numerous locations across the Midwest, appearing without the warning of radar or the buildup of thunderclouds. These were not traditional tornadoes. They were singular strips of violent rotation that would select a specific yard or a single street, twisting trees and lifting vehicles into the air before vanishing as quickly as they arrived, leaving the surrounding neighborhood completely untouched. This deliberate, chosen pattern of destruction is what locals find most unsettling, because it defies the predictable laws of meteorology and suggests an atmosphere that is no longer behaving according to human expectations. Isaiah 13:13 declares that the heavens will be shaken and the earth shall move out of her place, a direct address to times when the natural order breaks down to serve as a divine megaphone for those who have stopped paying attention. When the very air you breathe starts to deviate from the norm, it reveals the thinness of our confidence in systems and forces us to confront deeper questions about our spiritual preparedness. Even the vast reaches of the Pacific coast were not exempt from this awakening, as seasoned fishermen reported witnessing the surface of the sea crack open at dawn to reveal a shape bigger than any known whale, rising with a purposeful, measured control. This creature, covered in scales that shimmered like molten bronze, did not flee in fear or attack in hunger. It simply circled the vessels as if it were measuring and weighing the observers, a living manifestation of the ancient power described in Job 41 regarding the Leviathan, a beast that no man can subdue. The emergence of what has been long hidden in the deep is a direct challenge to a comfortable faith that equates silence with absence, reminding us that the boundaries of the deep are held only by God's command, a command that now seems to be shifting. Why do we only seek the truth when the ground starts to shake and the sea begins to roar, rather than in the quiet moments of our daily lives? The violet glow over Washington, D.C. is the culmination of these signs, a visual representation of a world that is no longer isolated in its disasters, but is moving toward a total, unified convergence of sky, land, and sea. We are being asked to identify a direction rather than just a date, to recognize that these are not haphazard pieces of disorder, but a deliberate sequence intended to awaken those who are open to the truth. The bigger risk is not the hail, the vortices, or the rising leviathans, but the loss of awareness in a society that tries to label and disregard every miracle and every warning as a mere headline. Scripture presented these times as a final window, a chance to return and readjust our sights before the pressure becomes an explosion that can no longer be ignored. As you stand with your family and watch these indicators manifest in real time, ask yourself if your faith has become as thin and cold as those overturning icebergs, or if you are ready to stand when the foundations finally give way. Leave your prayers in the comments and tell us, do you truly believe these are coincidences, or can you feel the invisible weight of the violet sky pressing down on your soul? We are witnessing the language of indicators, a language intended to be seen, felt, and acted upon before the darkness fully descends. May we all have the eyes to see and the hearts to understand the message being written across the world today, for the signs are no longer coming, they are already here. Uncertain whether to record the phenomena or simply watch the heavens in a state of suspended animation, people across the country stood motionless and silently observed as the very fabric of the atmosphere seemed to shift before their eyes. There was an incredible weight in the air, the kind of heavy spiritual pressure that presses within a person's soul rather than outward against their skin. But strangely, there was no immediate terror in the crowd. Many later claimed that they felt monitored by an inexplicable and ancient force, rather than being watched by one another, creating a collective consciousness of divine observation that transcended modern logic. What did not occur during these moments was perhaps more unsettling to the seasoned onlookers and scientific experts alike, because there was no solar flare detected, no lightning strikes, no magnetic disturbances, and no storm systems within 1,000 miles of the area. Clear skies were confirmed by the most advanced military satellites, yet the instruments found nothing out of the ordinary, even as a brilliant light was clearly visible to thousands of witnesses. Hovering momentarily over the legislative halls of the Ozark Plateau before receding just as gently as it had appeared. The hue of this light itself carries a staggering significance that we cannot ignore, as violet has traditionally been associated with ultimate power, holiness, and the absolute weight of monarchy since the dawn of civilization. Scripture consistently links this specific color to the presence of the Creator and the high priesthood, making the setting of this light even more significant for believers who understand that this was not happening over an open ocean or a far-off, uninhabited desert. This was the center of regional decision-making, the seat of authority where laws are drafted and moral guidance is debated. And the Bible discusses these veils of light with a gravity that should make us tremble. According to Matthew 27:51, the temple veil was split in two from top to bottom when the ultimate sacrifice was made, representing a judgment and an exposure that was not concealed from below but made possible by a higher power. If you were standing there, would you see it as a sign of impending justice or a final moment of mercy before the great shaking intensifies? Revelation 1:7 warns that he is coming with the clouds and every eye will see him, which leads to the inevitable inquiry for those gazing up at the violet skies. What is being revealed underneath the veil that is currently hovering over our centers of power? Is this a direct warning to a country whose faith has waned and been replaced by a cold reliance on policy and human strength? Scripture demonstrates that God does not always yell when our faith begins to freeze. He occasionally appears in the silence to see who is still awake. Remain with me, because the message is never insignificant when the curtain of human power is lifted and the true authority of the heavens begins to manifest. Silently at first, the number of reports began to skyrocket as tall vertical columns of light appeared in the night sky throughout the rugged terrain of Tennessee and Kentucky, standing perfectly straight and immobile like pillars ascending from the red clay of the earth into the deep heavens. These weren't random streaks or flashes of light, and they didn't bend like lightning or disperse like fireworks. Instead, they appeared purposefully, falling slowly from the clouds, pausing in midair to hover silently, and then rising abruptly back into the darkness. The sheer control of these lights was what worried the witnesses most because there was no flickering, and they didn't float aimlessly. They appeared to be guided as they walked with a terrifying purpose through the atmosphere. Faint human-like outlines briefly emerged within the radiance, upright figures shaped like people, visible for only a few seconds before disappearing back into the blinding brightness of the pillars. Viewers did not express curiosity or excitement, but spoke of a deep, intuitive unease, feeling that what they were witnessing was intended to draw their spiritual attention rather than provide mere amusement. These sightings took place far outside the major hubs like Nashville and Louisville, appearing close to significant population concentrations, where the sky was perfectly clear, and air traffic records showed absolutely no aircraft, drones, or experimental flight paths. Although authorities acknowledged the footage, the ensuing hush from official institutions only increased the gravity of the moment, leaving people on their own to find meaning when the systems they trust are unable to provide a solution. Signs that emerge in the heavens during times of spiritual transition are clearly addressed in the book of Zephaniah, which speaks of a day of clouds and thick darkness where the mighty man shall cry bitterly as the land is searched with lamps. Luke 21:11 forewarns of magnificent signs from heaven that act as signals rather than spectacles, suggesting that creation itself becomes a witness to our growing estrangement from the divine. Once regarded as impartial and predictable, the sky has now become a warning painting, and the image of vertical light has an ancient significance that symbolizes direction and power. Just as a pillar of fire guided the lost in the wilderness, these contemporary columns are raising awareness on a deeper level, making people halt their busy lives and challenge their presumptions about safety and control. Why are these lights appearing now, over cities where spiritual attention is at its weakest and where diversions abound? The Bible cautions that signals become more intense when faith is depleted, not to frighten us into submission, but to awaken us from a deadly apathy. The threat is not the lights themselves, but the potential for you to ignore them as a simple coincidence and go back to sleep. When the sky starts making purposeful signals, it is often too late to ignore the convergence of the elements, because within the same limited time frame, the wind, the earth, the sea, the ice, and the sky have all started to react in unison. These episodes are no longer isolated to a single area. They are overlapping and pressing in from several directions simultaneously, representing a common disturbance across different components of the globe. Storms are traveling with a peculiar and predatory intent. The ground is moving without warning, and the water is releasing what it has held in check for millennia. Science can explain the how of each individual event, but it is utterly unable to explain the why of the timing. Why are so many systems responding at the exact same moment? This takes away the ease of calling it a coincidence and replaces it with a peaceful yet chilling awareness that the old sense of control is waning and the world is no longer predictable. Luke 21:25-28 describes nations in turmoil due to confusion and indications on earth and in the heavens, but it also gives a command. Stand up straight and raise your heads because your redemption is approaching. God rarely communicates with a single sign. He uses the convergence of the entire creation to overcome our apathy and test our hearts. Why does everything seem so uneasy all at once, and why do the scientific explanations feel so hollow and lacking? According to Scripture, when creation speaks collectively, it is because the people have stopped paying attention to the still, small voice, making this convergence a threshold announcement, a final moment of choice before the exposure leads to consequence. God's pattern is consistent throughout the prophecy of Micah, which warns that the mountains will melt under him and the valleys will split like wax before the fire as a witness against those who have forgotten their foundations. He sounds the alarm before allowing the collapse, and these indicators serve as signals at a crossroads designed to compel consciousness before the movement becomes irreversible. The turbulent waters, the shifting Mojave terrain, and the variations in the sky are not proclamations of annihilation, but are a decision point, a pause that gives you time to acknowledge the situation and take action. The Bible never portrays caution as cruelty. It portrays it as an act of supreme kindness, but mercy is only effective if it is accepted by a heart that is actually awake. Right now, your biggest threat is not the storm or the lights. It is the gradual loss of focus and the tendency to explain everything away until the warning is no longer relevant to your life. Previous generations have been undone by the assumption that there will always be more time, but Revelation 3:2 provides a clear directive for this very day. Awaken and fortify what remains. This suggests that something within us has already become weaker, and that a further delay could lead to the total failure of our spiritual standing. The window for introspection is getting smaller as the warnings become more severe, and the pauses between disasters become shorter. Even when the indicators are silent, they seem louder than ever, and the anxiety persists because something has changed fundamentally beneath the surface of reality. Are you getting ready, or are you assuming there is still time as the signals grow stronger? We appreciate you sticking with this urgent message, and if this made you feel a shift in your spirit, do not dismiss it. Recently, the United States has seen a series of unsettling incidents that defy logic, including a 2,000-mile winter storm that moved as a single, coordinated system through the heart of the Great Lakes, freezing roads and bringing down entire power grids. In the far north, the ice didn't just melt. It broke apart in a massive glacier deluge that caused rivers to reach all-time highs and forced overnight evacuations of entire communities. At the same time, the plains of Nebraska and Iowa saw powerful hailstorms that destroyed reinforced roofs and turned summer roadways into ice fields, while walls of dust engulfed the Mojave Desert, eliminating all visibility and causing a total blackout for tens of thousands. These are different places and different elements, but they are happening at the same time, leaving people perplexed and unprepared for the greatest catastrophe to ever strike the nation. The entire world is staring in disbelief as a gigantic storm system unites snow, ice, and bitter cold into a single, well-coordinated force that refuses to pass swiftly. Freezing rain is currently covering the highways of the Texas Panhandle, creating sheets of ice that are snapping ancient trees and trapping millions in a dark, frozen reality. How much longer will you wait to acknowledge the pattern that is unfolding right before your eyes? As temperatures fell far below the point of freezing, entire neighborhoods across the heart of the country lost power in a synchronized collapse of the grid, leaving thousands of families trapped in a freezing, absolute dark with no idea when their warmth or their light would ever be restored. Responders were instantly overworked to the point of exhaustion, often switching frantically between life-threatening exposure calls where the elderly were freezing in their beds and chaotic crash sites on black ice that looked like war zones. Airports were forced to close their runways as visibility vanished, and all around the country, every single flight was canceled, leaving travelers stranded in terminals that felt like makeshift shelters. Travel was forced to a total stop, not by choice or by voluntary caution, but by the sheer, unyielding force of a nature that refused to be managed or negotiated with by modern technology. Conditions deteriorated rapidly as the massive system proceeded east, carrying a weight that felt heavier than simple winter air. And by the time it reached the Carolinas, the region was hit with a devastating ice buildup that made major highways completely impassable and separated once-connected neighborhoods into isolated islands of survival. As high-tension wires broke beneath the weight of ice that these southern areas were never designed to handle, power outages spread like a contagion, leaving millions to fend for themselves in a climate they didn't understand. Snow and ice exacerbated already precarious winter conditions in the Northeast, burying historic cities under white blankets of silence and straining transportation infrastructure to the absolute breaking point. Forecasts were confirmed with a terrifying accuracy. Grocery store shelves were stripped bare within hours, routines were permanently erased, and even the most damaged homes went black as the last of the backup generators failed. The storm synchronization, in addition to its raw ferocity, was what made it particularly destructive to the human spirit. As the cold, the snow, and the ice all came at once in a coordinated assault rather than one after the other. Have you ever felt like the world was closing in on you from all sides at the exact same moment, leaving you with nowhere to run? There was no window for recuperation or breath, and the systems that usually depend on the interval between occurrences to repair and reset were completely overloaded and rendered useless. In real time, the stability we take for granted simply disappeared. And while the atmosphere can be described in technical terms by meteorologists and infrastructure failure can be explained by structural engineers, the deeper pattern itself seems obvious to people who are conversant with the ancient truths of Scripture. In the book of Zephaniah, God inquires about the storehouses of the snow and the hail which have been reserved specifically for the time of trouble, suggesting that these are not random accidents of geography. Snow and ice are not described as chaotic or accidental in the Bible. They are described as purposeful forces that are restrained by a divine hand until the moment they are released to serve as a witness. The same haunting truth is repeated in the Psalms, where the frost is scattered like ashes and a question is posed to all of humanity: who is able to withstand his cold? This is not poetic hyperbole or creative writing. It is cautionary language intended to strip away our pride. Even more startling, the ancient texts of Exodus describe an uncommon intensity that strikes an unprepared country, an occurrence remembered throughout history for its shock rather than its duration. It's hard to deny the chilling similarities today, as the full impact of severe winter is now being felt in southern and coastal areas that are not used to such a burden. This storm did more than just interfere with travel plans. It revealed the profound weakness of our modern world, and demonstrated how easily contemporary stability vanishes when the divine constraints are even slightly removed. You are not alone if you recognize this developing confluence of events, because scripture-savvy people see the pattern emerging right before their eyes. Stay with me, because this storm could not be the end of the sequence, but rather a long-written warning that is currently taking place in real time across the globe. Rain clouds or storms approaching from the sea did not pose the primary threat to the people of Juneau, Alaska, but instead, the danger emanated from both above and below the ice itself. When a rapid glacier outburst from Suicide Basin unexpectedly released billions of gallons of held meltwater, the city was hit by a record-breaking flood that defied every modern projection. The region was on the edge of a total catastrophe when the flood raced into the Mendenhall River within a few hours, driving the water to climb to the greatest crest ever recorded in human history. Water surged into storm drains, private yards, and residential streets, flooding low-lying areas and dragging heavy trash and ancient debris with it as the surge blocked the path of entire neighborhoods. Recently erected flood barriers, standing over 2 meters high, absorbed the incredible pressure and prevented a potentially disastrous devastation that would have leveled the community. Without these makeshift defenses, hundreds of homes would have probably been drowned, replicating or surpassing the destruction witnessed in prior years, as local officials quietly acknowledged behind closed doors. Engineers and emergency personnel kept a close eye on the flood in real time, using drones to monitor the surge from above as flow gauges surged into the red zones. As massive branches and uprooted trees crashed into the barriers and water flowed through with a tremendous guttural force, field crews examined the integrity of the walls. Pressure caused the heavy metal and earth to bend, but by some miracle, it remained intact through the night. Following urgent warnings, residents in flood-prone areas had already left their lives behind overnight, preventing the need for dangerous rescues at the most hazardous times. As a precaution, shelters were opened, schools were closed, and power was turned off in high-risk locations to prevent electrocution in the rising tide. Scientists explain how meltwater can accumulate beneath ice until it abruptly ruptures by pointing to retreating glaciers and rising temperatures. And while the mechanics can be quantified, it remains difficult to explain the timing. For almost 10 years, this basin has frequently flooded, but this specific incident broke all prior records, proving that every year the scale gets bigger and the margin of error for humanity gets smaller. A deeper echo is recognized by those who are familiar with the Book of Lamentations, where it is described that the fountains of the great deep erupt when the foundations are ignored. This flood wasn't random, but it also wasn't complete devastation. It was a moment where the barriers hardly held and mercy triumphed over judgment for one more day. Stay with me, because the next warning could not come with the same restraint if the deep keeps releasing its secrets. The threat did not come silently to central Oregon, but fell forcefully from the heavens in a display of power that left the landscape unrecognizable. Strong gusts and enormous hail, which many locals reported were the biggest they had ever seen in their lifetimes, were unleashed by a powerful thunderstorm that ripped through the region like a saw. What had started out as gloomy clouds swiftly turned into a torrent of falling ice, crushing reinforced roofs, shattering windshields into powder, and transforming regular roadways into dangerous passageways filled with frozen rubble. Power fluctuated among areas as the storm grew worse, and thousands of people were abruptly cut off as communication and internet cables failed under the bombardment. As the storm cell became more distinct and violent, thunder reverberated for miles with a frequency that felt like a constant roar. Meteorologists near the city of Bend issued urgent warnings for quarter-sized hailstones and winds of up to 60 miles per hour, but the reality on the ground was much more severe. With several storm cells forming nearly back-to-back, The system proceeded quickly north, leaving absolutely no time for recovery between the warnings. As debris flew through the air, emergency notifications cleared the roads, and hail fell in furious waves in the Old Mill district, bouncing off houses and sidewalks like lethal shrapnel. As many fled for safety, videos showed the loud, metallic sound of ice hitting concrete and metal, while cold slush made the streets as slippery as glass. Automobiles had a hard time moving as tires skidded and control disappeared in a matter of minutes. People at the local resorts were forced to crouch together in fear as ice formed around their feet due to hail that was several inches deep on the ground. Something disturbing was left behind after the storm eventually passed: a dense, strange fog known as hail fog, which is a mixture of chilled air and steam that creates an otherworldly atmosphere. The abrupt silence that followed was as startling as the actual storm, and reports of fallen limbs, tilted power poles, and torn siding were made throughout the entire area. Hailstorms are explained by strong updrafts and atmospheric instability, but the mechanics only explain the formation of the ice. They do not explain the timing or the intensity of such a targeted strike. An ancient warning language is recognized by those who are conversant with the prophecy of Joel, where fire and hail are suddenly thrown upon the world to disrupt the peace of those who have forgotten the Creator. Hail is described in the ancient texts as something held and discharged at specific times rather than being dispersed at random. And this storm revealed just how quickly our safety and our power can be taken away. Stay with me, for ice falling with such power could not be the last reminder that materials under restraint can suddenly be unleashed. Strong winds suddenly tore across southern Nevada, turning what had started out as a typical afternoon into instant darkness and terror for the residents of the desert. Las Vegas was unrecognizable in a matter of minutes as the sky grew a sickly brown and the air became thicker with every breath. Walls of dust engulfed entire neighborhoods as they moved through the city like a solid, breathing force of nature. As debris blew through residential areas along the famous Strip, the skyline vanished, the neon lights dimmed into nothingness, and palm trees twisted almost horizontally under the pressure. Gusts of up to 70 miles per hour were reported by wind monitors, and the force of this storm originated from dry microbursts, a shock wave of cooled air that crashed hard to the ground and extended outward like an explosion. Power poles broke all around Clark County, leaving over 30,000 patrons in complete and total darkness as dust covered homes and streets like thick smoke. The quality of the air deteriorated so fast that people were choking in their own living rooms, and the number of emergency alerts increased quickly, unable to keep up with the storm's speed. Utility wires toppled, and transformers ignited small fires that looked like beacons in the dust. And firefighters were overworked as they responded to several wind-driven flare-ups. Waves of gusts returned for hours, leaving the valley encircled by rubble and darkness. Residents entered an eerie silence, scattered wreckage, and the feeling that something essential had changed when the calm eventually restored. The mechanics are explained by scientists as surface pressure release, but they don't say why this is happening now. Older terminology is recognized for such moments by persons who are conversant with Scripture, such as the warnings in the book of Amos regarding